idea to organize a public conference on the developmental role of education came up while I was doing a study on this very topic, the developmental power of education. And this study was commissioned by the German Development Corporation, GIZ. And the aim was to review recent and influential scientific literature on the effects of education in different developmental fields. And while I was researching this literature, it came to my mind that actually it is very striking that there are so many different scientific disciplines researching into this question, into this field, and elaborating on this question, and so many different methods and approaches, and so many controversial and different viewpoints. So some scientific disciplines see a very direct effect of education on development, and others say that the thing is much more complicated and complex. So I thought that it would be interesting to point to this very controversial scientific discussion about the role of education on development. And the idea was to organize a public discussion, inviting one person to represent the education optimistic view and another person to represent the rather skeptic view on education. So we invited two very brilliant scientists who will try to put forward a very lively and controversial discussion on this very topic. And I have the honor to introduce them to you. So to my left is Wolfgang Lutz. He's among the most renowned Austrian scientists. He's a demographer by education, and since 1994 he has been leading the World Population Program at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, as we already heard. And since 2002 he is head of the Institute of Demography at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and since 2008 professor at the Institute for Statistics and Mathematics at the Viena University of Economics. In 2010 he received the Wittgenstein Award, which is the most renowned Austrian award for scientists, and consequently he founded the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Human Capital. And here it is, I would say, your interest for education under the name of human capital. And I remember well, Professor Lutz, an intervention by you about 1.5 years ago in this very room at a conference on the role of education in coping with emergency situations. And in this intervention you recommended education as one of the most important investments in development, and so you have been doing in many articles. So here is the optimistic view on education, and I'm very much looking forward to your thesis. On the other side there is Xavier Bonal, I hope I pronounced it correctly. He is professor in sociology at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona and director of the Globalization, Education and Social Policies Research Group at the Department of Sociology at this very same university. And he's also special professor of education and international development at the University of Amsterdam. And Professor Bonal's research actually surprised me for his critical and somewhat provocative stance on the question of education and development, and in particular on the question of education and poverty reduction. Because contrary to the general opinion in international development discourse, Professor Bonal's research on Latin America showed that the link between education and poverty reduction is not straightforward but very complex, and that in many cases investments in education have not helped to overcome poverty.
Now let's first say, what is the education effect? Why do we assume that education matters for people? And we've just written a big 900-page volume to be published by Oxford University Press, where we have a separate chapter on what we call the causal effects of education on health and on fertility and also on income. So here it is important to say that education is not just a proxy, an indicator of socioeconomic status. That's what is often seen by economists or sociologists, something that is assigned to people, and with better education you belong to a higher social class. Now what we are focusing is that every learning process for every individual changes our brains. It builds new synapses in our brains. And as Eric Kandel used to say, you may know Eric Kandel is a former Austrian, but he was driven out of Austria in the 1930s, and he received the Nobel Prize in medicine for his brain research in the year 2000. And I had the opportunity of several times being in a seminar with him, and he uses to say, now, let's repeat this point once again, and you memorize it now, and now you have lots of new synapses in your brains. And when you walk out through this door, you're physiologically a different person than when you came in. So education changes our brains, and with our brains, it changes the way we see the world and the way we act and all kinds of behaviors. And there's lots of empirical evidence that really it enhances the cognitive skills. We can later talk about really the level of abstract thinking, how you put things into higher categories. Comes along with literacy, very high correlation. It extends the personal planning horizon. You think further into the future. You think more rationally from the future, and you also learn better from past experiences or past damage. And then, of course, education also empowers people. They have more access to information and tends to reduce inequality, and that's one of the points that we have to argue about. Then clearly you have better access to relevant information. It clearly, and this is probably the most important for me, it improves our health and our physical well-being. My colleague Eric Strisnik here in the audience has also done analysis with respect to happiness. There seems to be a very strong effect of education on individual stated subjective happiness. And of course it increases our income at the individual as well as the households as well as the national level. Now all over the world we see massive differences to mother's education and infant mortality. Here you just see some selected African countries. You again have no education in red, some primary in yellow, and secondary or higher, sort of at least to the age of 15 in school in blue. And here you have the under 5 mortality, like out of 1,000 children in Ethiopia, 220% used to die if the mother has no education, and less than 10% if the mother has secondary or higher. And you see these massive differentials in virtually every country around the world. Now, many economists say, of course, this is a function of income. Of course, the more educated are also the richer. So we've done a series of studies focusing what is more important for the survival of children. Is it the education of the mother or the wealth of the household? Of course, they are correlated, but they're not identical. So what we did here is a very simple 2 times 2 matrix. We cut the population into the poor half of households and the richer half, and the lower educated half and the more educated half. And of course, what you see, the poor and low educated, they have the highest infant mortality rate, and the high, rich, highly educated, they have the lowest. But it's interesting to look at the off-diagonal. There are, of course, people who are poor, but rather highly educated, and they have consistently lower infant mortality rate than the rich, but uneducated. So this is just a very simple, but we have a complex multivariate model that consistently show that your mindset, the skills, and the education you have is more important for the survival of your children and of yourself than how thick your wallet is. I think there, first of all, education is not an elusive sorting of some sort, but it is really something that changes people's mind, changes our brains, changes the way we view the environment and we react to the environment. And it is generally empowering. And particularly basic education, basic literacy, and basic numeracy, these are the most important empowering factors for our better health, for poverty eradication, and for our adaptive capacity and resiliency to environmental change. The other point is that once you sort of have more specific education indicators, not just take some average figures for the entire population, but look at age group wise and look at the full distribution, then you are much better able to identify the positive effects of education than if you lump everything together. And in conclusion, I want to say, of course, nobody can claim that education automatically leads to any of these desired outcomes. In the social sciences, nothing is automatic. You see here, there is, of course, a variation here, and in every such analysis, there's a variation. but we can say there is a very high probability, and that's what you see here, also the association, a high probability that education leads to this desired for consequences. And I would even go further and claim that of all development policies that are there, improving the mental skills, improving the education people is the single most important one. Thank you.
I was commissioned to do a study on this topic, how education impacts development, commissioned by the German Development Corporation, and I had to review scientific literature on this topic. And when I was doing that, it became very apparent to myself that there is no simple answer, but there are many answers, there are many approaches, there are many methods, and many different ways to look into that question, and very controversial, not to say opposite answers. So I thought this is actually an important point also to keep in mind, that there is not the answer to the question how education impacts development. As in some fields a positive impact, mostly on private income. So this is in the literature, this is a kind of uncontested result. Education has under any circumstances a positive impact on personal income, and on health also, and on, let's say, fertility rates. These are the aspects where the literature finds that education has a positive impact. And on many other aspects there is a relative impact, or let's say it depends on the circumstances, and this is economic growth, this is also female empowerment, this is democracy. So these are the main findings, and the circumstances, which probably was the most striking to me, is that equality is a very important factor. Educational equality, but also social equality. So in a society where the social inequalities are very, very, very high, then education mostly is also very unequal, and it also can have a very negative impact, so in the sense of deepening these inequalities. So this was a finding which I thought is very, very relevant for development.
There's many things with which I can advance. I agree with Professor Lutz in the argument. The question I want to add mainly here is that I would say that the answer is it depends. Okay? So it depends. It depends under which conditions do we talk about the potential effects of education to reduce poverty and to reduce inequalities. And I think, and my argument here is that this is a central question. It's not a marginal one. It's not just to decide about how much education we put here, and then we discuss about how do we manage the policy and how do we distribute it. But this is a central issue. Depending on the way you distribute education, if you do it in a very unequal way, probably your effects in terms of poverty reduction will be useless. So it's a central issue. And what I want to argue here also is that many central agencies, international organizations that are developing mainstream agendas in this issue mainly ignore this type of topics. And I think more research has to be developed in this issue. Let me start by giving just some blue points which I think would coincide mainly with Professor Lutz's presentation. From the human capital theory development in the 60s, we know that education has private benefits and public returns. And we know that societies that are better educated, we've seen with this data, and we know it, that are able to reduce mortality rates, to have less fertility rates, are able even to reduce criminality rates within society. So there's so many externalities which are very positive. And we also know that the effects in terms of private returns, in terms of income, are positive. Even we know that in aggregate terms, there is a relationship between education, the expansion of education, and economic growth. although there are some economists today that are challenging this question, talking about expanding education is not enough, and what is really necessary is the performance of education, like Eric Hanushek, for instance, very well-known American economist that is really stressing this type of issues.
Education is not an absolute value, not an intrinsic value, but a relative value. That, for example, if education is being massified and many people have access to education, and then not only primary but also secondary and also higher education, then the value of education for the individual diminishes. So if you want to use education as a vehicle for social accession, then you need more education. So it's something that is also used to distinguish yourself from the lower social classes. And these aspects, I think, are very important and are mainly overlooked in mainstream educational theory, where educational theory works on development.
We know, just to take this into account also, that the human capital theory has been also criticized. For instance, Lester Thurow, which is a well-known economist, was critiqued with the World Bank and was trying to show that not always there's a parallel expansion of education and growth. Okay? You can see sometimes that education expands in some societies, but growth does not at the same rhythm. You can see, for instance, today in the middle of a crisis in Europe, educational demand grows very much because there's no jobs, and education becomes what Thoreau called a defensive strategy. So I invest in my education especially to avoid going down to the secondary labor market, with a lot of rotation, with a lot of precarious jobs. So this is one issue that we have to take into account. Thoreau also taught us about the expansion of education and its relationship with the inequality of income. And he showed data for the US and see that so much expansion of education can happen, and at the same time you can have a worse distribution of income. Okay? This is something that you can see today in the middle of the processes of globalization. We have more education than ever, and we have high, tremendous rates of inequality. Okay? Then we have, on the one hand, what we can call the proportion problem, as I said before, and now what we can understand as the attribution problem also. And there are periods in which there is simultaneous expansion of education on the one hand and increasing levels of poverty. You see, for instance, what happened in Latin America during the last decade, in the 80s. There was no contraction of education because education was expanding, but because of very harmful other social policies, the overall effect on poverty was to increase poverty. And that's why it was called the last decade. And finally, one of the arguments I think it's important to highlight is that inequality matters. I was stressing this at the beginning. I'm not saying that education cannot contribute to reduce inequalities, but we have to look at what is the effect of educational expansion in countries depending on their inequality. So I'm proposing in some way to invert the relationship. Let's look at what inequality is doing to education. Let's look at what poverty is doing to education. And then, my proposal is then we can start studying and debating about what are the most likely effects of education to reduce poverty or inequality. So my questions would be, why such an effort in education, which is huge, it's translated into a relatively weak effect on poverty reduction. So we have a problem of the proportion problem. The rate in which education is increasing does not correspond with the rate of poverty reduction. The second one is education the cause of the relatively weak poverty reduction? So we could confront here with a very complex issue. Wolfgang was mentioning it at the end of his presentation it's very difficult to guess strict causality about this. So we might have also an attribution. There's many other variables that can intervene here.
So if you look at China and India, I think that's a good comparison. They're always sort of, they're both more than $1 billion, and India has invested heavily in elitist education, while for caste system reasons or whatever, sort of leaving half of the population behind of the lower castes in less uneducated, essentially, mostly women also. Whereas China has really invested in educating everybody. Part of the communist ideology. And then, of course, they opened up the market, but economically, China has been doing so much better precisely because they had less educational inequality than India.
Many of the debates that are going on an international level, they are very high-level discourses. I'm more aware of the local situations and what these discourses mean, because of course the national policies will be crafted after what's been decided on those international levels, so it's not unimportant. But it's sometimes easier to look at the local level to see the effects of such policies, or how to comprehend the effects or the needs. So looking at like projects that I know, it's like, for example, Mr. Bonal was talking about educability and what are the factors that are hindering people from entering from school. For example, in the Philippines, you have the right for free and compulsory education, but we did a research on child labor in one of the islands in Negros, and what became clear is that children, they could go to school, but they just cannot, because they have to contribute to the income of the family, so they will be working on the sugar plantations. So what would be the policies there? There could be free schooling for them, but it doesn't work. It doesn't lead to the children going to school. So the research found out, well, okay, where does the program need to start? So they came up with a program designed for a livelihood income for the parents, for the community, so in order for the children to be able to go to school. So I think it needs that kind of research, which is also looking at the context, looking at the local situation also, which can be even within a country, can be very diverse.
I'm saying that it would be a mistake on my understanding to think about educational development from the modernization theory of the stages of growth and then the role it could play linked very much to specific economic sectors and to this type of development. I think education is also a story of cultural imperialism. It's also a story in developing countries where the colony has tamed the indigenous populations also. And indigenous education has been denied in many places. And part of the story of educational failure in some of the countries has to do with this. It's not only that they didn't have education, it's also that they received an education very delinked from their own experiences and their own cultural roots and their own stories. I'm not saying that just adapting education to the cultural needs would by itself make a huge change on this, but I think it is a very important issue, and we are seeing now that with more indigenous education and with multicultural education in some places, the attachment of children to schooling is increasing. Otherwise, what you see is that as I said, part of the school failure can be explained partly because of this kind of cultural alienation that some children experience in schools.
And that's also a trend, I think, in the education discourse, that education as as an economic factor, and as the whole question of the economization of education, that is just seeing education as a product or something I have to acquire in order for my personal career, rather than something that makes me aware, that makes me able to critically think and question society. So I think this is also something would be important for me, that education is more than that, not more than that economic approach.
I think one of the important things today in these debates is that learning is substituting access in some way, which is positive. So we know that it's not enough having access, because we have to care about what's going on within schools. But at the same time, this should make us not to forget that access can be very important, or input policies have to be very important as well. So we have to be aware that still finance of education is important, teacher quality is the extremely important issue in terms of the quality of education in developing countries. And on the other side, I would say it is very important how to link education policies to other social policies. I think the secrets are here in some way, that development, as you probably are aware of and know, it has to do much more with how education, health, social services relate to each other, and how really can help children to learn at school, but also to have other effects in their own communities. And this is one of the most important challenges and the most difficult things, because I think governments themselves, sometimes it's very difficult to do intersectoral work between them, because they have their own departments which can hardly meet each other, they have separate budgets and these type of things. And even international organizations or international NGOs themselves are organized in a way that is very sectorial, and it's not easy to find good bridges for them to work in this.
So we need an integrated approach.
Definitely, definitely.
I think, yes, to take this aspect of inequality into account is maybe the most important recommendation, and this should feed into policy making. Like the conditions should be provided so that all people, not only children but also adults, should firstly be in a condition to get education and get also qualitatively good education. And of course there is the question, what is educational quality? But I leave this now aside, but we have to bear in mind that this is an important question. It's not very easy to define what is educational quality. But anyway, so this is, I think, important, that the government, but also the society as a whole, has to bear in mind if there is education has to be a right and a good for everyone, but then you also have to look, is there a specific education for the poor people and for the rich people? So then you will not be able to use education as a tool to get out of poverty. So this is very important to look at educational inequality and educational equality.